Chapter 1. Introduction. Why Syria is a fascinating topic. Imagine a country that has been a crossroads of cultures for thousands of years. A country that lies between the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia and has thus repeatedly become the stage of world history. A country that has been the scene of empires, religions, revolutions, and tragedies, and yet is still full of life, beauty, and diversity today. That country is Syria. The history of Syria is one of the oldest we can tell. It does not begin with kings or battles, but with the first cities of mankind. Ebla, Mari, Ugarit, these are not only archaeological sites, but also resounding names that show us that Syria was a center of civilization over 4,000 years ago. From here, ideas, languages, religions spread. In short, building blocks of today's world. But the fascination of Syria does not only lie in its early days. For thousands of years, it was the focus of great empires. Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, Ottomans, they all left their mark. Syria has never been an isolated country, but always a link. Whoever ruled Syria controlled access between East and West. Today, we hear the name Syria and immediately think of war, destruction, and suffering. Since 2011, the Civil War has forced millions of people to flee and devastated the country. But if we only look at this section, we lose the big picture. For thousands of years, Syria was not only a crisis area, but also a place of exchange, prosperity, and cultural greatness. Why the history of Syria at all? The question is justified. Why should we deal with the history of Syria? The answer is clear. If you want to understand why Syria is so torn today, you have to know its past. Syria is not an artificial state that came into being after the First World War, but an area that has had political, religious, and economic significance for thousands of years. Many of the conflicts we see today have roots in its long history, whether it's tensions between different religious groups, the struggle for influence in the Middle East, or the importance of the region to world powers. And last but not least, Syria is a cultural treasure. Anyone who understands the history of Syria also understands an important part of human history: the fascination of Syrian history. Syria is home to countless achievements, myths, and legends. One of the oldest alphabet scripts in the world was developed in Ugarit. In Damascus, one of the oldest permanently inhabited cities in the world, thousands of years of buildings and traditions are mixed. Palmyra, the desert city, was a center of trade and culture, a kind of ancient Dubai in the middle of the steppe. And in Aleppo or Homs, centuries of Islamic, Christian, and Jewish history are reflected. But Syria is not just a success story. It is also a country full of contradictions. Times of prosperity and prosperity alternated with times of war and oppression. Great personalities such as Queen Zenobia or the caliphs of Damascus leave their mark on memory, just as much as the tragedies of sieges and destruction. It is precisely this mixture, the shiny and the dark, that makes Syrian history so exciting. The common thread of our journey. So that we don't get lost in this long history, we divide our journey into different chapters. We start in the early days, with the first cities such as Ebla and Mari. Then we look at the great empires that conquered Syria again and again: Hittites, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. We take a look at Byzantium and the early Christianity that shaped Syria. We move on to the Arab conquest, when Damascus became the capital of the powerful Umayyad Caliphate. We look at the time of the Crusades and the rule of dynasties such as the Ayyubids and Mamluks. We come to the Ottomans, who ruled Syria for centuries. We see how the country fell under the French mandate in the 20th century and eventually becomes a modern state. And we shed light on the Assad dynasty and the devastating civil war of the present. In the end, we take a look ahead. What role can Syria still play after all the suffering and destruction? What to expect? This video is not a dry history lesson full of dates and years. We tell stories. Stories of kings and rebels, of merchants and warriors, of poets and builders. Stories that show us how Syria has always been at the center of world history. There will be moments when we will be amazed at how modern and progressive Syria was even in ancient times. And there will be moments when we are shocked by how cruel wars and rulers could be. It is precisely this tension, the shiny and the dark, that makes Syrian history so exciting. So, sit back, join me on this journey, and let's immerse ourselves in over 5,000 years of Syria's history.
Chapter 2: The Early Period, Mesopotamia, Ebla and Mari. If we want to tell the story of Syria, we have to go back a long way, to a time when there were no nations or kingdoms in the modern sense. At that time, Syria was located in the middle of one of the most important regions in world history, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Euphrates and Tigris. Some of the first advanced civilizations of mankind arose here. But Syria was not only a peripheral region of the world, but a theater in its own right. Cities, palaces, archives were created here, and stories that still resonate today. The cradle of civilization. Archaeologists have found that sedentary communities lived in Syria over 10,000 years ago. Places such as Tel Abu Huraira on the Euphrates or Tel Halaf in the northeast show that people were among the first to practice agriculture and livestock breeding here. They grew grain, legumes, and lentils, kept sheep and goats, and thus laid the foundation for a new way of life, away from nomadism and towards permanent settlements. These early village communities gradually developed into cities, and these cities would soon play their own role in world history. Ebla, the forgotten metropolis. One of the most fascinating places in Syria's early history is Ebla, located in what is now the northwest, near Aleppo. In the 1970s, archaeologists made a sensational discovery there: over 17,000 clay tablets in cuneiform, dating back to around 2400 BC. These panels opened a window into a world that had long been forgotten. Ebla was a powerful city with around 20,000 to 30,000 inhabitants, huge for that time. It ruled over a wide area that stretched as far as present-day Lebanon and Turkey. The economy was based on trade. Wool, wood, metals, and luxury goods passed through the gates of Ebla. Particularly exciting, names that we know from the Bible appeared in the archives, such as Abraham, or cities such as Sodom and Gomorrah. This shows how closely the world of the early Syrians was connected to the later traditions. Ebla was not only a center of power, but also of administration. The clay tablets list treaties, trade agreements, religious rituals, and even dictionaries in different languages. They are a treasure for historians who recognize the first globalized structures of the world here. But as so often in history, Ebla's shine ended dramatically. Around 2200 BC, the city was destroyed by the Akkadians, an emerging empire from Mesopotamia. Later it recovered again, but was again razed to the ground. Mari, palaces on the Euphrates. Another jewel of Syria's early history was the city of Mari, directly on the Euphrates, near today's border with Iraq. Mari was famous for its gigantic palace, one of the largest in antiquity. Over 260 rooms, richly decorated with frescoes, served as the residence of the kings. Mari also lived from trade. Due to its location on the Euphrates, it was a hub for goods from Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Mediterranean region. Mari's archives contained thousands of letters and administrative documents. They show how diplomacy worked almost 4,000 years ago. Kings sent gifts to each other and demanded alliances. They talked about campaigns, but also about weddings. Marriage was politics. Even everyday problems such as famines or uprisings can be found in the letters. One of the most famous rulers of Maris was Zimri Lim, who ruled in the 18th century BC. His reign came to an abrupt end when the Babylonian king Hammurabi, yes, the same one with the famous law code, conquered and destroyed Mari. Ugarit, the city of the alphabet. Another highlight of Syria's early history is Ugarit, near today's Mediterranean coast. Here, archaeologists discovered something revolutionary. One of the oldest alphabet scripts in the world, created around 1400 BC. Unlike the complex cuneiform script, it consisted of only about 30 characters, a system that strongly influenced our current alphabet. Ugarit was also an important port. From here, ships sailed to Cyprus, Egypt, and the Aegean Sea. In the texts from Ugarit, myths also appear that later found their way into biblical stories, such as the fight of the storm god Baal against the Sea of Chaos. But, like so many cities of the time, Ugarit fell victim to the great upheavals around 1200 BC, when the mysterious Sea Peoples shook the entire eastern Mediterranean. Syria as an interface. If we look at these cities, Ebla, Mari, Ugarit, we see a pattern. Syria has been an interface from the beginning. It connected Mesopotamia with the Mediterranean Sea. It brought cultures together: Semitic, Anatolian, Mesopotamian, Egyptian. It was a place of exchange, but also of conflict. Syria was to play this role again and again in the millennia to come, as a transit country, a treasure trove, as a plaything of the powers. Significance of the early period. Why is this early period so important? Quite simply, many foundations were created here that still shape the region today. Urban development. The tradition of urban centers goes back further here than almost anywhere else. Script. From the cuneiform scripts in Ebla to the alphabet of Ugarit, Syria has contributed significantly to the development of writing. Religion. Many gods, myths, and rituals from Syria later influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Trade. Syria has never been just an agricultural country, but always a hub for goods and ideas. One could say that in the early days of Syria, not only cities were created, but also the foundations of our modern world. View. With the demise of cities like Ebla and Mari, Syria's history was by no means over. On the contrary, even greater powers now appeared on the scene: the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. Syria became the playing field of imperial interests, and a phase began in which the country was conquered, destroyed, and rebuilt again. But before we go there, let's remember, Syria's history does not begin with Rome or with the Arabs. It begins with farmers on the Euphrates, with traders in Ebla, with myths in Ugarit, and with the incredible diversity of a region that has never stood still.
Chapter 3. The Empire of the Hittites and Assyrians. After cities such as Ebla, Mari, and Ugarit flourished, Syria entered a new phase of history. The region was too valuable to remain insignificant, too fertile, too rich in resources, too important as a link between Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Mediterranean. From the 2nd millennium BC, Syria became the playing field of powerful empires. Two empires in particular were to shape the fate: the Hittites and the Assyrians. They made Syria one of their most important theaters, sometimes as a vassal country, sometimes as a battlefield, sometimes as the core area of their empire. The Hittites, lords from Anatolia. The Hittites originally came from Anatolia, i.e. from the area of today's Turkey. As early as the 17th century BC, they founded a powerful empire with the capital Hattusa. Their influence reached far south, and thus into Syria. Especially in the 15th and 14th centuries BC, they made it clear to the local kings who was in charge here. Hittites versus Egyptians. A key event was the rivalry with Egypt. Syria was not only important for the Hittites, but also for the pharaohs on the Nile. Why? Quite simply, Syria was the bridge between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Whoever controlled Syria controlled the trade routes for timber, copper, silver, and luxury goods.
The most famous battle of this rivalry was the Battle of Kadesh, circa 1274 BC. Location: the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River in present-day Syria. Opponent: Ramses II, one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs, against Muwatalli II, the Hittite king. Result: no clear decision. Both sides claimed victory for themselves. But the battle had consequences. Hittites and Egyptians later concluded one of the oldest known peace treaties in the world. A copy of this treaty now hangs in the UN headquarters in New York, a symbol of how Syria wrote world history even then. Influence of the Hittites. The Hittites left behind not only battles in Syria, but also culture. They brought their gods, their writing, and their administration with them. Particularly interesting, they adopted many elements from the peoples they conquered. Syria was a melting pot, and the Hittites helped to mix different traditions. The Assyrians, warriors from Mesopotamia. If the Hittites were considered pragmatic diplomats, then the Assyrians were the exact opposite. They were the merciless warriors of Mesopotamia. The Assyrians had already made their first attempts at expansion in the 2nd millennium BC, but their real prosperity began in the 9th century BC. With rulers like Assur-Nasir-Pal II, Tiglath-Pileser III, and later Ashurbanipal, they built one of the most powerful military empires of antiquity. Conquest of Syria. For the Assyrians, Syria was a strategic target. It provided access to the Mediterranean Sea. It was rich in cities that could pay tributes. And it was a buffer against Egypt and later Babylon. The Assyrian armies were notorious, disciplined, brutal, and well-organized. They used iron weapons, siege engines, and psychological warfare. Many Syrian cities such as Damascus, Arpad, or Aleppo had to bow down, pay tributes, or were destroyed. Cruelty as politics. The Assyrians understood power, and they knew fear is a better instrument of domination than love. In inscriptions, they boasted of how they burned down cities, skinned opponents, or deported entire populations. That sounds cruel, and it was. But there was a system. Anyone who resisted the Assyrians was destroyed. Those who obeyed were allowed to live. This created a huge empire that completely integrated Syria. Deportations and cultural transfer. One of the Assyrian strategies was the resettlement of entire populations. Thousands of Syrians were brought to the heartland of Mesopotamia, while other peoples were shipped to Syria. This had two effects. Uprisings were made more difficult because local identities were dissolved. Syria became even more of a cultural melting pot. In Assyrian palaces such as Nineveh, we still find reliefs depicting Syrian cities, landscapes, and even animals. Syria was an integral part of the Assyrian world. The decline of the great powers. But no empire lasts forever. The Hittites disappeared around 1200 BC, probably in connection with the mysterious Sea Peoples. Their empire collapsed, and only smaller successor states such as Carchemish remained in Syria for a while. The Assyrians, on the other hand, held out longer, but in the 7th century BC, their empire also collapsed. Babylonians and Madai destroyed Nineveh in 612 BC, a shock for the world at the time. For Syria, this meant that a new power vacuum arose, which was soon filled by others, the Babylonians and later the Persians. Significance of this era. Why are Hittites and Assyrians so important for the history of Syria? They finally made Syria a key area of world politics. They left traces in language, religion, and administration. They showed that Syria was not only a country of cities, but also a country that held empires together. The Hittites brought diplomacy and treaties, the Assyrians brought military power and administrative art. Both together shaped the region for centuries. View. With the fall of the Assyrians, the stage opened up to new powers. Babylonians, Persians, and finally a young man from Macedonia were to lead Syria into a new era. But before we get to Alexander the Great, we need to look at Babylonian and Persian rule, a time when Syria once again became a hub of global development.
Chapter 4. The Persians and Alexander the Great. After the fall of the Assyrians, Syria was once again a country in upheaval. The old great powers disappeared, but the power vacuum did not last long. First the Babylonians, then the Persians, and finally Alexander the Great left their mark, and made Syria a stage on which world history was written. The Babylonians, incident in world events. After the fall of Assyria, around 612 BC, the Neo-Babylonians first took control of Syria. King Nebuchadnezzar II, 604 to 562 BC, is the best-known ruler of this era. For Syria, Babylon was one thing above all, a strict ruler in the background. Many cities had to pay tributes, and again there were uprisings that were bloodily suppressed. Jerusalem, in particular, was destroyed during this period, 586 BC, and a large part of the population was deported to Babylon, an event that went deep into Jewish history. Syria was also directly affected by these conflicts, as it was located on the border between Babylon and Egypt. But the Babylonian rule was short-lived. After only a few decades, a new, even larger empire was to take over the region. The Persians, Syria in the kingdom of the great king. In 539 BC, the Persians, under Cyrus the Great, conquered Babylon. Syria thus became part of the Achaemenid Empire, one of the largest empires of antiquity. Administration and order. The Persians were skillful organizers. Their empire was divided into so-called satrapies, provinces ruled by satraps, i.e. governors. Syria belonged to the satrapy Ebla and Mari, the land beyond the river. This administration brought stability. Taxes were levied, roads were built, trade was promoted. For the first time in centuries, there was a relatively long period without constant wars in Syria. Religion and tolerance. The Persians differed from the Assyrians. They ruled less through terror than through tolerance. Peoples were allowed to keep their religions as long as they paid taxes and remained loyal. Thus, in Syria, a colorful mixture of god cults, languages, and traditions could coexist. Trade and connections. The Persians built famous roads, including the Royal Route, which led from Susa to present-day Turkey. Syria benefited enormously because it was in the middle of this trade network. Goods from India, Central Asia, and Persia arrived here and were distributed from Syrian cities such as Damascus or Sidon to the Mediterranean. Alexander the Great, the storm from Macedonia. In the 4th century BC, everything changed. A young Macedonian king named Alexander began to conquer the Persian Empire. The campaign against Persia. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, now Dardanelles, and defeated the Persians at the Battle of Granicos. Shortly afterwards, the decisive encounter in Syria followed, the Battle of Issos, 333 BC. Location: near today's Syrian-Turkish border. Opponent: Alexander against the Persian king Darius III. Result: Alexander won despite numerical inferiority. Darius fled, and Alexander controlled Syria from then on. The capture of cities. Many cities in Syria surrendered without a fight. Others were severely punished. The siege of Tyre, 332 BC, was particularly notorious. Tyre was an island city that thought it was safe. Alexander had a huge dam built to connect the island with the mainland. After months of siege, the city was conquered and cruelly destroyed. The message was clear: those who resisted were wiped out. Syria as part of the Hellenistic Empire. Alexander marked the beginning of a completely new era for Syria, the Hellenistic period. Greek culture, language, and architecture were introduced. New cities were founded or renamed, such as Antioch, which would later become one of the most important metropolises in the East. Greek temples, theaters, and grammar schools shaped the cityscape. At the same time, Greek culture merged with native culture, a synthesis known as Hellenistic. After Alexander, Syria between the Diadochi. Alexander died young, in 323 BC, at only 32 years old.
His empire fell apart immediately, and his generals, the so-called Diadachi, fought over the succession. For Syria, one name in particular was decisive: Seleucus I Nicator. He founded the Seleucid Empire and made Antioch on the Orontes its capital. This marked the beginning of a new phase. Syria became the center of a Hellenistic empire dominated by Greeks but deeply rooted in Oriental traditions. Significance of this era. Why is the time of the Persians and Alexander so important for Syria? The Persians gave Syria a stable administration and integrated it into a world empire. Alexander brought Syria into contact with the Greek world, a connection that was to shape culture, language, and religion for centuries. Cities such as Antioch became symbols of this fusion of Orient and Occident. One could say that Syria finally became a melting pot during this time, a country in which Persians, Greeks, Semites, and many other peoples left their mark. View. The Seleucids mark the beginning of Syria's Hellenistic flourishing, which later passed into Roman influence. But before Rome entered the scene, Syria experienced a turbulent but also culturally rich epoch under the Seleucids and in conflicts with Egypt.
Chapter 5. Roman Syria, from Antioch to Palmyra. With the death of Alexander and the struggles of his successors, Syria entered a new epoch, the Hellenistic world under the Seleucids. But this reign did not last forever. Step by step, Syria came under Rome's sphere of influence, and eventually became one of the most important provinces of the Roman Empire. From the Seleucids to Rome. After Alexander's death, Syria was part of the Seleucid Empire, which was ruled from Antioch. Antioch on the Orontes became one of the most magnificent cities of antiquity, a metropolis with theaters, palaces, and a lively commercial life. But the Seleucids had powerful rivals, the Ptolemies in Egypt in the south, the Parthians in the east. The so-called Syrian wars between Seleucids and Ptolemies repeatedly turned the country into a battlefield. By the 1st century BC, the Seleucids had largely lost their power. Civil wars, succession disputes, and external threats weakened the empire. In this period of weakness, a new power entered the scene: Rome. Pompey and the incorporation of Syria. In 64 BC, the Roman general Pompeius Magnus invaded Syria. Officially, he came to pacify unrest and stabilize the region. In truth, however, it was a simple conquest. Syria became the Roman province of Syria with Antioch as its capital. This marked the beginning of a new era. For almost 7 centuries, Syria was to remain part of the Roman world. Antioch, Rome of the East. Under the Romans, Antioch developed into one of the most important cities of the empire. Some even called it the Rome of the East. Antioch was a melting pot. Romans, Greeks, Jews, Syrians, and many other peoples lived side by side here. The city was known for its luxurious villas, magnificent mosaics, and imposing temples. It was the seat of the Roman governor and the center of administration. Antioch also had enormous cultural significance. It became one of the first places where Christianity took root. The Bible says that it was here that Jesus' disciples were given the name Christians for the first time. Palmyra, the desert pearl. In addition to Antioch, another city played a prominent role: Palmyra. Located in the middle of the Syrian desert, Palmyra developed into a trading metropolis. Caravans from Persia, India, and Arabia stopped here before taking their goods onto the Mediterranean. Palmyra was rich, and it showed that wealth. Even today, the ruins bear witness to gigantic temples, long colonnade streets, and magnificent burial towers. It was the seat of the Roman governor and the center of administration. Antioch also had enormous cultural significance. It became one of the first places where Christianity took root. The Bible says that it was here that Jesus' disciples were given the name Christians for the first time.
Palmyra, the desert pearl. In addition to Antioch, another city played a prominent role, Palmyra. Located in the middle of the Syrian desert, Palmyra developed into a trading metropolis. Caravans from Persia, India, and Arabia stopped here before taking their goods onto the Mediterranean. Palmyra was rich, and it showed that wealth. Even today, the ruins bear witness to gigantic temples, long colonnade streets, and magnificent burial towers. It was the seat of the Roman governor and the center of administration. Antioch also had enormous cultural significance. It became one of the first places where Christianity took root. The Bible says that it was here that Jesus' disciples were given the name Christians for the first time. Palmyra, the desert pearl. In addition to Antioch, another city played a prominent role, Palmyra. Located in the middle of the Syrian desert, Palmyra developed into a trading metropolis. Caravans from Persia, India, and Arabia stopped here before taking their goods onto the Mediterranean. Palmyra was rich, and it showed that wealth. Even today, the ruins bear witness to gigantic temples, long colonnade streets, and magnificent burial towers. Zenobia, the Queen of Palmyra. In the 3rd century AD, Palmyra even wrote world history. Under Queen Zenobia, the city rose up against Rome. Zenobia was a charismatic and educated ruler. It extended its empire to Egypt and Asia Minor. Antioch and many other cities fell to it. For a short time, Syria was independent, a Palmyrene empire under the rule of a woman. But Rome reacted quickly. Emperor Aurelian defeated Zenobia in 272 AD. Palmyra was plundered, Zenobia brought to Rome. This ended the dream of Assyrian power. Christianity in Syria. Syria played a central role in the history of Christianity early on. Antioch was an important center of the early church. This is where the Apostle Paul worked. From Syria, Christianity spread eastward, as far as Persia and India. Cities such as Edessa, today Urfa in Turkey, then Syrian territory, became strongholds of Syrian Christian culture. Syria thus became a link between the Roman world and the Christian communities of the East. Syria as a borderland. For Rome, Syria was not only culturally important, but also militarily. In the east, it bordered on the Parthians and later the Sassanids, bitter rivals of the Roman Empire. Again and again there were battles on the borders, at Karha, 53 BC, or in the campaigns of the emperors Trajan and Severus. Syria was thus one of the most militarized provinces of the empire. The presence of Roman legions shaped the country. Fortresses, roads, and cities were expanded to secure the border. Late antiquity and change. In the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, Rome changed, and with it Syria. The empire became Christian when Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313. Syria experienced a flourishing of monasteries and churches. Cities such as Antioch and Edessa became centers of theology. At the same time, however, Syria remained a conflict zone. Rome and Persia continued to fight for supremacy in the east. When the Roman Empire finally split into a western and eastern part in 395, Syria fell to the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium. This marked the beginning of a new phase in which Syria became part of the Christian Greek world. Significance of the Roman era. Why was the Roman period so formative for Syria? Cities such as Antioch and Palmyra became world metropolises. Christianity found its first centers outside Palestine here. Roman infrastructure, roads, water pipes, fortresses shaped the country for centuries. Syria was the hinge between Rome and the East, economically, culturally, and militarily. One could say that under Rome, Syria finally became part of the global world order, and it remained so under Byzantium. View. The transition to Byzantium marks the beginning of a new chapter. Syria now became a heartland of the Christian world, but not for long. And the 7th century, a new power was to come out of the Arabian desert and fundamentally change the country: Islam.
Chapter 6: Byzantium and Early Christianity. When the Roman Empire finally split into a western and an eastern part in 395, Syria fell to the east, to what we know today as Byzantium. With the new capital Constantinople, the empire became more Greek, Christian, and Oriental, and Syria played a key role in this transformation. Syria in the Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, saw itself as the heir of Rome. Administration, law, and the military initially remained Roman, but language and culture shifted. Greek became the dominant official language, and Christianity became the mainstay. Syria was one of the wealthiest provinces of the empire. Antioch was the third largest city in the empire after Constantinople and Alexandria. The region produced grain, olive oil, and wine, valuable goods for the entire empire. Syrian cities were also intellectual centers in which theology, philosophy, and science flourished. Antioch, metropolis of the East. Antioch remained one of the most magnificent cities of antiquity under Byzantium. It was the seat of the Patriarch of Antioch, one of the most important bishops in the Christian world. Theologians, philosophers, and clergymen from all over the world flocked here. Antioch was also known for its schools, which gave rise to Antiochian theology, an interpretation of the Bible that focused heavily on the historical context. But Antioch was not only a place of piety. Contemporaries also reported luxury, markets full of exotic goods, and a lively urban life. The spread of Christianity. In the Byzantine era, Christianity finally spread to Syria. Monasteries sprang up in the desert, where monks led an ascetic life. The pillar saints are famous, such as Simeon Stylites, who lived on a high column for decades and thus became a model of Christian piety. Cities like Edessa became centers of Syrian Christian culture. Here, a separate language flourished, Syriac, a form of Aramaic, in which many theological texts were written. At the same time, Syria developed into a place of intense theological debates. Disputes such as the nature of Christ led to deep divisions. These divisions were to have consequences later. Many Syrian Christians felt alienated from Constantinople and therefore supported new rulers when the Arabs arrived in the 7th century. Conflicts with the Persians. Byzantium inherited not only the cities and wealth of Syria, but also its geopolitical location. Syria was located directly on the border with the Sassanid Empire, in Persia, an eternal rival. Again and again, there were wars in which Syria was devastated. Cities such as Antioch changed rulers at times. Especially in the early 7th century, just before the rise of Islam, the Persians conquered almost all of Syria and held it for over a decade. The population suffered from these endless struggles. Some regions had been depopulated, fields destroyed, trade interrupted. Natural disasters and epidemics. In addition to wars, natural disasters also hit Syria. Several earthquakes shook Antioch and destroyed parts of the city. Epidemics such as the Justinian plague from 541 AD killed hundreds of thousands. These catastrophes further weakened the region and contributed to the fact that the Byzantiums were unable to secure Syria permanently. Culture and everyday life. Despite all the crises, Syria remained a place of cultural flourishing. Syrian Christians developed a rich literature in their language, Syriac. Artists created magnificent mosaics and churches that are still admired today. In the cities, Christians, Jews, and pagans initially lived side by side, even though Christianity increasingly dominated. Particularly exciting, many Syrian Christians did not see themselves as Byzantiums, but as an independent community. This identity lasted for centuries and explains why Syria followed the new Arab rulers relatively quickly in the 7th century. Syria on the eve of Islam. By the early 7th century, Syria was exhausted. Decades of wars between Byzantium and Persia had bled the country dry.
Religious tensions between the Orthodox Church of Constantinople and local Syrian churches created mistrust. Natural disasters had weakened entire cities. When the first Muslim armies came out of the Arabian desert, they encountered a region that was tired and ready for upheaval. Significance of the Byzantium era. Why was the time under Byzantium so important for Syria? Syria became a heartland of early Christianity, with theologians, monasteries, and bishoprics. Cities such as Antioch shaped the theology and culture of the entire Mediterranean region. The centuries-long conflicts with Persia weakened the country and indirectly prepared the ground for the Arab conquest. One could say that under Byzantium, Syria was both culturally and religiously at the heart of the world, but politically a weak point of the empire. View. In the 7th century, a new era dawned with Islam, and Syria became the heartland of a caliphate that ruled half the world. From Damascus, one of the greatest transformations in world history began, and Syria was once again at the center.
Chapter 7. The Arab Conquest and the Umayyad Caliphate. In the 7th century AD, the Middle East changed fundamentally. A new power arose from the Arabian desert, Islam. Within a few decades, entire empires were swept away, and Syria became the center of one of the most powerful dynasties in world history, the Umayyads. The Arab conquest of Syria. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 AD, his successors, the caliphs, began to spread the message of Islam beyond Arabia. Syria was one of the first targets of this expansion, and for good reason. It was rich in cities and agricultural resources. It was strategically located between Arabia, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean Sea. The population was worn down by decades of wars between Byzantium and Persia. The Battle of Yarmouk, 636 AD. The decisive moment came in 636 AD, when Muslim troops met the Byzantine army. Location: on the Yarmouk River, near today's border between Syria and Jordan. The Arabs fought under the leadership of Khalid ibn al-Walid, one of Islam's greatest generals. The Byzantines, under Emperor Heraclius, suffered a crushing defeat. After this battle, the way to Syria was clear. Cities such as Damascus, Homs, and Jerusalem fell in the following years. Damascus, capital of the Caliphate. After the conquest, Syria was not on the fringes, but at the center of the new order. The Umayyad dynasty, 661 to 750 AD, made Damascus the capital of the Caliphate. This meant that Syria became the heart of an empire that stretched from Spain in the west to India in the east, one of the largest empires in world history. The Umayyad dynasty. The Umayyads originally came from Mecca, but were particularly powerful in Syria. Its founder, Muawiyah I, made Damascus the capital. Under the Umayyads, Syria experienced an enormous boom. Palaces, mosques, and administrative buildings were built. The caliphate was centralized and tightly organized, with Syria as the administrative center. The Umayyad Mosque. One of the most famous buildings of this era is the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. It was built on the remains of a Christian church. With its magnificent mosaics and monumental architecture, it is considered one of the most important mosques in the Islamic world. To this day, it is a symbol of Syria's heyday under the Umayyads. Everyday life in the Umayyad Empire. Under the Umayyads, Syria was not only a political center, but also a cultural one. Arabic became the administrative language, an important step in the Arabization of the empire. Trade flourished. Goods from India, China, and Africa flowed through Damascus and Aleppo. Religious diversity remained. Christians, Jews, and other groups continued to live in Syria, often as dhimmis, protected but taxable minorities. Many Christians who had previously felt alienated from Byzantium came to terms with the new rulers surprisingly well. Expansion and conflicts. From Damascus, the Umayyads carried out huge expansions. To the west to Spain, conquest 711. To the east to India and Central Asia. In the north as far as Byzantine Asia Minor. But not everything went smoothly.
There were internal conflicts, especially between different Muslim groups: Sunnis, Shiites, Arabs from Syria, and Arabs from Iraq. These tensions eventually led to the downfall of the Umayyads. The fall of the Umayyads, 750 AD. The rivalry between the Umayyads and the Abbasids escalated in the middle of the 8th century. In 750 AD, the Umayyads were defeated in the Battle of the Great Zab in Mesopotamia. The new Abbasid dynasty moved the capital to Baghdad. Syria lost its role as the center of the caliphate. Only one Umayyad escaped, Abd ar-Rahman I. He fled to Spain and founded the Umayyad Emirate of Córdoba, which later became a cultural beacon in its own right. Syria after the Umayyads. With the end of the Umayyad dynasty, Syria fell into a supporting role. It remained important, but the real power now lay in Baghdad. Syrian cities such as Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs remained trading centers. Religious and cultural diversity continued to shape the country. But politically, Syria was now a province, not the capital. This shift was to have far-reaching consequences. Syria once again became a borderland between the Abbasids in the east and the Byzantines in the west. Significance of this era. Why was the Arab conquest so decisive for Syria? Syria went from being a peripheral region to the center of a world empire. Damascus was the capital of the largest empire in the world for almost a century. Islamization and Arabization have shaped Syria to this day. Buildings such as the Umayyad Mosque show the cultural greatness of this time. In short, under the Umayyads, Syria was at the height of its global importance. View. After the fall of the Umayyads, a new phase began. Syria became a border country again. In the centuries to come, it became the scene of conflicts between Abbasids, Byzantines, Crusaders, and local dynasties. But before we get to the Crusades, we need to see how Syria developed under the Abbasids, and why it later became so easily the plaything of external powers.
Chapter 8. The Crusades and Ayyubid Syria. After the fall of the Umayyads, Syria was no longer the center of the Islamic world. The Abbasids ruled from Baghdad, and Syria was often only a border region between different powers. But from the 11th century onwards, everything changed. The Crusades shook the Middle East, and Syria once again became the stage for world political events. The background: weakness in the Islamic East. In the 11th century, the Islamic world was politically fragmented. The Abbasids in Baghdad had largely lost their power. In Syria, various local princes ruled, often in rivalry with each other. At the same time, the Seljuks, a Turkish people from Central Asia, advanced westwards and took over large parts of the Middle East. In this time of uncertainty, a new threat came from Europe: the Crusades. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099. Pope Urban II had called for a crusade in 1095 to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim rule. Thousands of knights and pilgrims set off and actually conquered Jerusalem in 1099. Syria was a central battlefield. Antioch was captured in 1098 after a long siege. The city became the seat of a Christian crusader principality. In Edessa, another crusader city was built. Aleppo and Damascus, on the other hand, were initially able to hold their own. Syria was thus divided. Parts were under Christian control, others remained Muslim. Life among the Crusaders. The Crusader states were small enclaves that could only survive through constant military vigilance. Castles such as Crac des Chevaliers were built, which remain as impressive ruins to this day. Trade and everyday life continued. Muslims, Christians, and Jews often lived side by side, although not without conflict. For the Crusaders, cities like Antioch were strategically important, not only militarily, but also as gateways to trade with the East. But the Crusader states remained unstable. They were dependent on constant support from Europe and surrounded by enemies. The Muslim response. Muslim rulers initially reacted disunited to the Crusaders. Local princes often fought against each other instead of together against the invaders. But slowly the awareness grew that only unity could push back the West. A first important step was the rise of the Zengids in the 12th century. Imad ad-Din Zengi, ruler of Mosul and Aleppo, succeeded in reconquering Edessa in 1144, the first major Muslim victory against the Crusaders. His son Nur ad-Din continued this struggle. He united Syria and prepared the ground for one of the most famous rulers in the Islamic world, Saladin. Saladin and Ayyubid Syria. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known as Saladin, became a symbolic figure of resistance against the Crusaders. Originally a Kurdish officer in the service of the Zengids, he rose to become a ruler. He founded the Ayyubid dynasty and initially made Egypt his base. From there, he conquered Syria and united the region under his rule. The reconquest of Jerusalem. In 1187, the decisive moment came. In the Battle of Hattin, Saladin defeated the Crusaders. Shortly thereafter, he recaptured Jerusalem. For the Muslims, this was a triumph. For the Christians, a catastrophe. This was followed by the Third Crusade, in which European rulers such as Richard the Lionheart tried to turn the tide. Although Richard achieved some success, Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. Syria and Palestine were thus firmly in the Ayyubid sphere of influence. Saladin's legacy. Saladin was often glorified as a knightly opponent in the West, but revered as a great hero in the East. His empire included Syria, Egypt, Palestine, and parts of Mesopotamia. Under the Ayyubids, Syria flourished culturally. New mosques, schools, and hospitals were built. Damascus and Aleppo developed into centers of Islamic scholarship. At the same time, the country remained marked by constant conflicts with remnants of the Crusader states. The last years of the Crusaders. After Saladin's death in 1193, his empire was divided into smaller dominions under his successors. The Crusaders remained in parts of Syria and Palestine for over a century. Especially the coastal cities such as Acre remained in Christian hands. But the pressure increased. The Ayyubids and later the Mamluks increasingly pressed the Crusader states. In 1291, Acre, the last great bastion of the Crusaders in the Middle East, fell. This meant that the age of the Crusader states was finally over. Significance of the Crusades for Syria. The Crusades were a time of destruction for Syria, but also of transformation. Many cities were besieged, conquered, or destroyed. At the same time, contact with Europe brought new exchanges, trade goods, ideas, even medical knowledge. The figure of Saladin became a symbol of unity and resistance, to this day. Above all, however, it became clear that Syria was not only a local country, but a region of global interest. Europe, Byzantium, Islam all fought for supremacy here. View. After the end of the Crusader states, a new power appeared on the scene, the Mamluks. They made Syria a core area of their empire before the Ottomans finally took control. But the experiences from the time of the Crusades shaped Syria for a long time to come, as a reminder of destruction, but also of cultural encounters.
Chapter 9. The Mamluks and Ottoman Rule. After the end of the Crusader states, Syria was once again in a phase of change. New powers appeared, old ones disappeared. Two epochs were now to shape the face of Syria: the Mamluk rule and the long phase of the Ottomans, who dominated the country for almost 400 years. The Mamluks, warriors from Egypt. The Mamluks were originally slave soldiers of Turkish and Caucasian origin who took power in Egypt in the 13th century. After their victory over the Mongols in the Battle of Ain Jalut, 1260, they became the saviors of the Islamic world, and Syria was at the center of this event. Battle of Ain Jalut, 1260. The Mongols had conquered large parts of Asia and were already in front of Damascus. The Mamluks opposed them in Palestine. The victory of the Mamluks stopped Mongol expansion, one of the most important events in world history. From then on, the Mamluks controlled Syria as part of their empire, which was ruled from Cairo. Syria under the Mamluks. Syria became a prosperous province of the Mamluk Empire. Damascus was the second most important city after Cairo. Caravan routes from India, Persia, and Arabia converged here. Important religious sites, such as Jerusalem, were administered from Syria. The Mamluks invested in infrastructure. Mosques, schools, caravanserais, and hospitals were built in Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs. The end of the Crusaders. After all, it was the Mamluks who dealt the death blow to the Crusader states. In 1291, they conquered Acre, the last great bastion of the Crusaders in the Middle East. This was the end of the Age of the Crusades. Syria played a key role in this final phase, as it was the base for the attacks on the Crusader cities. Challenges among the Mamluks. Despite their success, the Mamluks had to contend with problems. The Mongols remained a constant threat in the east. Within the empire, there were always power struggles and intrigues. Economically, Syria was dependent on trade routes, which became increasingly less important in the 15th century when the Portuguese discovered new sea routes to India. Nevertheless, Syria remained an integral part of the Mamluk Empire until the early 16th century. The rise of the Ottomans. Meanwhile, a new power was growing in the north, the Ottomans. Originally a small principality in Anatolia, they extended their rule and finally conquered Constantinople, 1453. This made them the dominant force in the Middle East. The conflict with the Mamluks. Inevitably, rivalries arose between the Ottomans and the Mamluks. Both claimed supremacy in the Middle East. Both controlled important trade routes. The decisive moment came in 1516, in the Battle of Marj Dabik, north of Aleppo. The Ottomans under Sultan Selim I defeated the Mamluks. Damascus surrendered without a fight. Shortly afterwards, Egypt also fell. The Mamluk Empire was history. This marked the beginning of Ottoman rule over Syria. Syria in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans firmly incorporated Syria into their empire and held it for almost 400 years, from 1516 until the First World War. Administration and structure. Syria was divided into provinces, so-called vilayets. The most important ones were Damascus, Aleppo, Tripoli, now in Lebanon, later also Deir ez-Zor. The Ottoman governor, Beylerbey, was the supreme authority, supported by local elites and religious leaders. Economy and society. Syria was part of the huge domestic market of the Ottoman Empire. Damascus was a central point of the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. Every year, a large caravan set off from here, protected by the Ottoman military. Aleppo became a major trading center, attracting merchants from Europe, including Venetians, French, and English. Religious diversity. Under the Ottomans, the millet system applied. Different religious communities, Muslims, Christians, Jews, managed their own affairs as long as they paid taxes. As a result, Syria remained culturally and religiously diverse. In Damascus and Aleppo, Muslims, Greek Orthodox Christians, Armenians, Jews, and many other groups lived side by side. Challenges of the Ottoman period. Despite relative stability, Syria also had to contend with problems under Ottoman rule. Local revolts, tribes in the desert, or ambitious governors tried again and again to break away from Istanbul. Natural disasters. Earthquakes and epidemics regularly hit Syria. Economic crises. With the discovery of the sea routes to India, Syria lost its importance as a hub of world trade. In the 19th century, the situation worsened. European powers such as France and Great Britain increasingly became involved in the region. Syria thus once again became a plaything of external interests. Significance of the Mamluk and Ottoman periods. Why are these centuries so important for Syria's history? The Mamluks stopped the Mongols and ended the Crusader states. They made Syria an important part of an Islamic empire. The Ottomans integrated Syria into a global empire that brought stability, trade, and cultural exchange. At the same time, they laid the foundations for many of the structures that were to exist into the 20th century. Syria was not an independent power during this time, but it was an indispensable part of larger empires. View. With the decline of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th and early 20th century, a new era began. European powers such as France and Britain made claims, and after World War I, Syria was to fall under a French mandate. Syria thus entered modern history with new hopes but also new conflicts.
Chapter 10. The Mamluks and Ottoman Rule. After the end of the Crusader states, Syria was once again in a phase of change. New powers appeared, old ones disappeared. Two epochs were now to shape the face of Syria: the Mamluk rule and the long phase of the Ottomans, who dominated the country for almost 400 years. The Mamluks, warriors from Egypt. The Mamluks were originally slave soldiers of Turkish and Caucasian origin who took power in Egypt in the 13th century. After their victory over the Mongols in the Battle of Ain Jalut, 1260, they became the saviors of the Islamic world, and Syria was at the center of this event. Battle of Ain Jalut, 1260. The Mongols had conquered large parts of Asia and were already in front of Damascus. The Mamluks opposed them in Palestine. The victory of the Mamluks stopped Mongol expansion, one of the most important events in world history. From then on, the Mamluks controlled Syria as part of their empire, which was ruled from Cairo. Syria under the Mamluks. Syria became a prosperous province of the Mamluk Empire. Damascus was the second most important city after Cairo. Caravan routes from India, Persia, and Arabia converged here. Important religious sites such as Jerusalem were administered from Syria. The Mamluks invested in infrastructure. Mosques, schools, caravanserais, and hospitals were built in Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs. The end of the Crusaders. After all, it was the Mamluks who dealt the death blow to the Crusader states. In 1291, they conquered Acre, the last great bastion of the Crusaders in the Middle East. This was the end of the Age of the Crusades. Syria played a key role in this final phase, as it was the base for the attacks on the Crusader cities. Challenges among the Mamluks. Despite their success, the Mamluks had to contend with problems. The Mongols remained a constant threat in the east. Within the empire, there were always power struggles and intrigues. Economically, Syria was dependent on trade routes, which became increasingly less important in the 15th century when the Portuguese discovered new sea routes to India. Nevertheless, Syria remained an integral part of the Mamluk Empire until the early 16th century. The rise of the Ottomans. Meanwhile, a new power was growing in the north, the Ottomans. Originally a small principality in Anatolia, they extended their rule and finally conquered Constantinople, 1453. This made them the dominant force in the Middle East. The conflict with the Mamluks. Inevitably, rivalries arose between the Ottomans and the Mamluks. The decisive moment came in 1516 in the Battle of Marj-Dabik, north of Aleppo. The Ottomans under Sultan Selim I defeated the Mamluks. Damascus surrendered without a fight. Shortly afterwards, Egypt also fell. The Mamluk Empire was history. This marked the beginning of Ottoman rule over Syria. Syria in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans firmly incorporated Syria into their empire and held it for almost 400 years, from 1516 until the First World War. Administration and structure. Syria was divided into provinces, so-called vilayets. The most important ones were Damascus, Aleppo, Tripoli, now in Lebanon, later also Deir ez-Zor. The Ottoman governor, Beylerbey, was the supreme authority, supported by local elites and religious leaders. Economy and society. Syria was part of the huge domestic market of the Ottoman Empire. Damascus was a central point of the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. Every year, a large caravan set off from here, protected by the Ottoman military. Aleppo became a major trading center, attracting merchants from Europe, including Venetians, French, and English. Religious diversity. Under the Ottomans, the millet system applied. Different religious communities, Muslims, Christians, Jews, managed their own affairs as long as they paid taxes.
As a result, Syria remained culturally and religiously diverse. In Damascus and Aleppo, Muslims, Greek Orthodox Christians, Armenians, Jews, and many other groups lived side by side. Challenges of the Ottoman period. Despite relative stability, Syria also had to contend with problems under Ottoman rule. Local revolts, tribes in the desert, or ambitious governors tried again and again to break away from Istanbul. Natural disasters, earthquakes and epidemics regularly hit Syria. Economic crises. With the discovery of the sea routes to India, Syria lost its importance as a hub of world trade. In the 19th century, the situation worsened. European powers such as France and Great Britain increasingly became involved in the region. Syria thus once again became a plaything of external interests. Significance of the Mamluk and Ottoman periods. Why are these centuries so important for Syria's history? The Mamluks stopped the Mongols and ended the Crusader states. They made Syria an important part of an Islamic empire. The Ottomans integrated Syria into a global empire that brought stability, trade, and cultural exchange. At the same time, they laid the foundations for many of the structures that were to exist into the 20th century. Syria was not an independent power during this time, but it was an indispensable part of larger empires. View. With the decline of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th and early 20th centuries, a new era began. European powers such as France and Britain made claims, and after World War I, Syria was to fall under a French mandate. Syria thus entered modern history with new hopes, but also new conflicts.
Chapter 11. The Assad Dynasty and the Ba'ath Party. After independence in 1946, Syria entered a phase of political instability. Hardly any other Arab country has experienced so many coups d'état in such a short time. Parties, military, and ideologues fought for power, until finally one family took the country firmly into their own hands, the Assads. Syria after independence, chaos and coups. In the first 2 decades of independence, Syria experienced a real roller coaster ride. Between 1949 and 1970, there were over a dozen coups and changes of power. Different currents shaped politics: liberal nationalists, communists, religious forces, and the military. The first major shock was the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, in which Syria, like other Arab states, suffered defeat. This defeat shook confidence in the old elites and paved the way for more radical movements. Rise of the Ba'ath Party. In the 1940s, Michel Aflaq and Salah al-Din al-Bitar founded the Ba'ath Party, Party of Arab Revival, in Damascus. Their ideology was based on 3 pillars: Arab nationalism, the unity of all Arabs in one state; socialism, nationalization of resources, land reforms, redistribution; secularism, religion should not play a dominant role in politics. The Ba'ath Party was particularly popular among young officers, students, and rural classes. Unification with Egypt. In 1958, a spectacular experiment took place. Syria united with Egypt to form the United Arab Republic, UAE. The president was the Egyptian head of state Gamal Abdel Nasser, a symbol of Arab nationalism. Many Syrians hoped that unity would bring strength against Israel and the West. But the euphoria did not last long. Syrian elites felt patronized by Cairo. Economic tensions grew. In 1961, a coup dissolved the union again. However, the experience left its mark. The dream of Arab unity remained an important motif in politics. The Ba'ath Putsch, 1963. In 1963, officers of the Ba'ath Party succeeded in a coup d'état. From then on, they shaped Syria's politics. A series of reforms followed: nationalization of large industries, land reforms, expansion of the education system. At the same time, the militarization of the state began. The military became the backbone of power. But rivalries also arose within the Ba'ath Party.
Various factions fought for supremacy, until one man prevailed, Hafez al-Assad. Hafez al-Assad, rise to power. Hafez al-Assad came from an Alawite family from the village of Kardaha in northwestern Syria. He joined the Luftwaffe and made a career there. As a member of the Ba'ath Party, he was involved in the 1966 coup that brought a radical faction to power. In 1970, he himself took over through a bloodless coup d'etat, the so-called Correction Movement. This marked the beginning of the era of the Assad dynasty. Syria under Hafez al-Assad, 1970–2000. Hafez al-Assad ruled Syria for 3 decades, authoritarian but stable. Domestic politics. Assad built up a system of intelligence services and the military that suppressed any opposition. The Ba'ath Party became the only dominant force. Political opponents, especially Islamist groups, were brutally fought. The culmination of this repression was the uprising of the Muslim Brotherhood in the late 1970s. In 1982, there was a massacre in the city of Hama. The army crushed the uprising. Thousands were killed. This event shaped the relationship between the regime and the Islamist opposition for decades. Foreign policy. Syria remained in conflict with Israel, especially after the loss of the Golan Heights in the 1967 Six-Day War. Assad positioned Syria as an opponent of Israel, but also as a power factor in Lebanon. During the Lebanese Civil War, 1975–1990, Syria intervened massively and controlled parts of the country for years. Economy and society. The economy remained heavily controlled by the state. Education and healthcare were expanded, but corruption and inefficiency slowed down development. Syria remained relatively poor, but stable, an important factor in a troubled region. Bashar al-Assad, from doctor to president. When Hafez al-Assad died in 2000, his son Bashar al-Assad became his successor. Hafez had originally intended his older son Basil as his heir, but he died in a car accident in 1994. Bashar, who actually lived as an ophthalmologist in London, was groomed as a candidate. The early years. Initially, Bashar raised hopes for reforms. In the so-called Damascus Spring, 2000–2001, intellectuals discussed democratization. But soon the regime struck hard again and ended any opening. Assad dynasty consolidates power. Bashar continued his father's authoritarian policies, but modernized the cult of personality. The secret services, the military, and the Ba'ath Party remained the pillars of the system. Critics ended up in prison or disappeared without a trace. At the same time, Bashar partially opened up the economy to the private sector, which benefited his own elite in particular. Syria before the storm. Until 2011, Syria seemed stable under Bashar, but behind the facade, it was fermenting. Economic inequality grew, especially between urban and rural areas. Political freedom was practically non-existent. The tensions between the religious groups, Sunnis, Alawites, Christians, and Kurds, remained suppressed but unresolved. The Arab Spring was supposed to bring all this to the surface and plunge Syria into the most serious conflict in its history. Significance of the Assad dynasty. Why is Assad's rule so decisive? It brought stability to Syria after decades of instability, but at the price of a brutal dictatorship. It has shaped the country to this day. The structures that Hafez al-Assad built up still exist. Under the Assads, Syria became an authoritarian state in which power, family, and intelligence dominated everything. View. In 2011, the facade broke apart. The regime, which had held its own for decades, was shaken by protests and responded with violence. The civil war that followed was to devastate Syria like hardly any other event before.
Chapter 12. The Civil War since 2011. The year 2011 marked a turning point in Syria's history. Within a few months, an authoritarian but seemingly stable state became a country in chaos. Today, the Syrian Civil War is one of the most devastating conflicts of the 21st century, with millions of displaced persons, hundreds of thousands of deaths, and immeasurable destruction. The Arab Spring reaches Syria. In January 2011, uprisings shook Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. Young people took to the streets demanding freedom, dignity, and an end to corruption. The mood also spread in Syria. In March 2011, protests began in the city of Dara after students sprayed graffiti critical of the regime. Security forces reacted brutally, shooting at demonstrators. Instead of stifling the movement, this further fueled the protests. Soon, people in Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo were also demonstrating. From protest to rebellion. Initially, the demands were moderate: more political freedom, an end to the arbitrariness of the secret services, reforms. But the regime's violence radicalized the movement. The army used live ammunition against unarmed demonstrators. Prisons filled with activists. Families who lost loved ones joined the opposition. Armed groups called the Free Syrian Army, FSA, soon emerged. Protest turned into rebellion, and rebellion into civil war. The disintegrating state. From 2012 onwards, Syria gradually disintegrated into different zones of power. The regime under Bashar al-Assad, which continued to hold Damascus, parts of Aleppo, and the coastal region. Opposition rebels who controlled large parts of northern and southern Syria. Kurdish groups that built autonomous structures in the northeast. Jihadist organizations that took advantage of the chaos. Above all, the Islamic State, IS. The country disintegrated. Each region was ruled by other militias, warlords, or foreign powers. Rise of the Islamic State. One of the most dramatic developments was the rise of ISIS. Originally emerging from al-Qaeda in Iraq, the group used the Syrian Civil War to spread. In 2014, it conquered large parts of Syria and Iraq, including Raqqa as its capital. ISIS staged a cruel reign of terror: public executions, enslavements, destruction of ancient sites such as Palmyra. ISIS has become a global symbol of terror, and Syria has become a battlefield for international powers. International entanglements. The Syrian Civil War was never just an internal conflict. It quickly became an international proxy war. Russia supported Assad with weapons, money, and, from 2015, with massive airstrikes. Iran sent militias and Hezbollah to keep Assad in power. The U.S. supported parts of the opposition and carried out airstrikes against IS from 2014 onwards. Turkey fought Kurdish groups in the north. Europe was directly affected by the refugee crisis from 2015 onwards. Syria became the center of geopolitical power struggles, a place where great powers fought their interests while the population suffered. Humanitarian catastrophe. The numbers are staggering. It is estimated that over 500,000 people died in the civil war. More than 6 million Syrians fled abroad, mainly to Turkey, Lebanon, and Europe. Millions more have been displaced within the country. Entire cities such as Aleppo, Homs, or Raqqa were reduced to rubble. The humanitarian crisis in Syria is one of the biggest since the Second World War. The War for Aleppo. A symbol of horror was the Battle of Aleppo, 2012-2016. Aleppo, once Syria's largest city, was divided into eastern and western halves. Rebels in the east, regimes in the west. Bombings, poison gas attacks, hunger blockades, the population suffered immeasurably. In 2016, the regime recaptured the city with Russian help. Aleppo became a symbol of the fact that Assad remained in power despite all the losses. Chemical weapons and red lines. The use of chemical weapons was particularly controversial. In 2013, there was an attack with sarin gas near Ghouta, near Damascus, in which hundreds of people died. The U.S. had described chemical weapons as a red line, but direct intervention failed to materialize.
Instead, an agreement was concluded, according to which Syria was to hand over its chemical weapons stockpiles. But there have been repeated reports of further attacks, a symbol of the regime's impunity and the failure of international politics. The current situation, status to date. 10 years after the start of the war, Syria is a fragmented country. Assad controls most of the west and center, thanks to Russia and Iran. Kurdish groups administer the northeast with the support of the U.S. Turkey occupies parts of the north. Idlib in the northwest remains a rebel stronghold, dominated by Islamist groups. There is no end to the conflict. Millions of Syrians live in exile. Entire generations grow up without a homeland. Significance of the Civil War. Why is this war so crucial in Syria's history? It has destroyed the country, economically, socially, culturally. It has made Syria a global symbol of flight, terror, and humanitarian catastrophes. It has shown how local conflicts can turn into endless wars through international interests. The Civil War has not only left Syria in ruins, but also torn apart its identity. View. The big question is, does Syria still have a future? Politically, Assad remains firmly in the saddle, supported by Russia and Iran. Socially, the country is deeply divided, between the regime, the opposition, the Kurds, and countless militias. Millions of Syrians live in exile and could play an important role in reconstruction, if it ever comes to that. The history of Syria is rich, but the scars of the Civil War will mark generations.
Chapter 13. Conclusion. Syria between past and future. We have a long journey behind us. From the first cities such as Ebla and Mari to the Assyrian, Persian, and Roman empires, the heyday of the Umayyads, the Crusades, the Mamluks and Ottomans, to the French Mandate, the Assad dynasty, and the devastating Civil War, Syria is a country that has always been at the center of history. Syria as a crossroads of cultures. If you look at the history of Syria, a pattern is striking. Syria has never been isolated, but always a transit country. In ancient times, it connected Mesopotamia with the Mediterranean Sea. Under Rome and Byzantium, it was a borderland and trading hub. Under the Umayyads, it even became the capital of a world empire. This situation brought prosperity and cultural diversity, but also constant conflicts. Whoever controlled Syria had influence on the entire region. Glamour and tragedies. Syria has always been a country of contrasts. Cities such as Damascus, Aleppo, and Palmyra experienced world-class heydays. At the same time, Syria has been conquered, destroyed, and rebuilt again and again. Personalities such as Zenobia or Saladin stand for greatness and strength, while massacres and civil wars show the dark sides of history. This ambivalence characterizes the country to this day. The long shadow of the present. Recent history has hit Syria particularly hard. The Civil War has uprooted millions of people, destroyed entire cities, and divided the country into zones of power. But this war is also part of a pattern. Syria has repeatedly become the plaything of external powers, be it Assyria, Rome, the Crusaders, the Ottomans, or, today, Russia, Iran, the USA, and Turkey. The question remains, will Syria ever find the path to real self-determination and stability? Hope and potential. Despite all the tragedies, there is also hope. Syrian culture lives on. Music, cuisine, literature, and crafts are deeply rooted and survive wars. The Syrian diaspora is huge. Millions of Syrians now live abroad, often well-educated. They could one day play a decisive role in reconstruction. The young generation knows the horrors of war, and perhaps also the desire to create something new from it. Syria has experienced new beginnings over thousands of years, so why not this time? Syria in the global memory. The history of Syria is not just a Syrian story. It is part of world history. One of the first alphabet scripts was created here. Christianity spread here early on. This was the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate. This is where the Crusades raged, which shaped the relationship between Orient and Occident. And today, Syria is a symbol of flight, war, and international interdependencies. Syria shows us that no country is alone. Each is embedded in larger structures. Looking ahead, no one can say for sure what the future of Syria will look like, but three scenarios are conceivable. Continued fragmentation. Assad remains in power in the west, Kurds control the northeast, Turkey holds parts in the north, a divided Syria without real unity. An authoritarian reconstruction. Assad or a successor rules the entire country with an iron fist, supported by Russia and Iran. A new beginning. A peace process leads to an inclusive government that brings Syria back together, perhaps with the participation of the diaspora. Whether the latter will happen depends not only on Syria itself, but also on the interests of the major powers. Final thoughts. The history of Syria is a story of resilience. Cities were destroyed and rebuilt. Empires came and went. Syria stayed. People fled, but they preserved their culture. Perhaps this is precisely the message of Syrian history. Despite all the tragedies, there are always new beginnings. Syria has survived thousands of years, and will survive this crisis as well. And this concludes our journey through over 5,000 years of Syrian history, from the first farmers on the Euphrates to the civil war of the 21st century. Syria is a country full of scars, but also full of stories. A country that teaches us how closely splendor and sorrow are linked in history.